Peace, everybody. So earlier today, I was checking out the discussions around HR 4, the HR 4 bill, which is basically created to advance the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the importance of the political process and what we could actually do to make sure that we are involved in the political process. So to start, I think it's important to understand that those of us who are indigenous or people who are of African descent, it's important to realize that when this country was started, it wasn't started with our legal status in mind. Meaning, even when you look at like the Dred Scott versus Sanford case of 1857, Dred Scott strived to sue the government because his enslaver took him to an area that was a free state, and he said, well, since I was there, I'm emancipated now, I'm free. And the Supreme Court, which is the highest court of the land, let him know, like, nah, bro, the Constitution wasn't even written with people of African descent in mind. So you can't sue somebody that you ain't even got legal right to be up in this court. So no, you are a slave, right? So that idea and that concept of denying people legal status has been a consistent theme even before this country was started. So if we're looking at the commonly defined date of 1619 being the first time that enslaved Africans set foot on the shores of Jamestown, Virginia, if we're looking at 1619 to the starting of this country in 1776, you have 157 years of enslavement throughout the colonies. So that's 157 years, over 5 generations of people of African descent, as well as indigenous people, not having a legal status here, not being a citizen and not having rights. When this country was started in 1776, enslavement or slavery became the law according to the foundation of this country. And it continued for another 89 years until you have the Emancipation Proclamation, right? So that 89 years represents a time period where we had no legal status in this land. We weren't citizens and didn't have citizens' rights or privileges or anything like that. Then, after slavery, you had 99 years of segregation, which was also the denial of our legal status because we were not allowed to equitably participate in American society. We were looked at as second class or no class at all. So things were segregated. So you have 89 years, 99 years, that's 188 years. The United States, this country is only 245 years old. So only being 245 years old, 188 of those years, or 77% of the time that indigenous or people of African descent have been on this land, we were denied the legal status and citizenship to equitably participate in American society. 77% of the time that this country has existed. That was the federal, state, regional, and local law. We had no legal status. So when you look at the Voting Rights Act that was passed in 1965, which basically said you can't discriminate against people when it came to voting, that Voting Rights Act was designed to reinforce the 15th and the 19th Amendment. The 15th Amendment that was passed in 1870 said it on a federal level, that you can't discriminate against people voting based upon their race. That was a federal law. But then in 1920, you had the 19th Amendment that said you can't discriminate against people voting based upon sex. So basically in 1920, women were allowed to vote, right? So it's very important that people understand, when you're looking at the history of this country, the legal status of people of so-called African descent or indigenous people was not included in the plan when it came to the colonialists starting this country. They didn't plan on us ever to have citizenship or any kind of legal status. That is one of the reasons why, when those of African descent did come here, as well as indigenous people, we were given a different name, because that stripped us of any kind of nationality, which is an international legal status, which connects us to an international community or international law. So without that nationality, we don't have an international status, and we're not protected under international law. When you don't have a legal status or citizenship in a country, you're also not protected by that so-called country itself, because you don't have the rights and the privileges of a citizen here. So when you look at us as a people being called Negroes or niggers or Afro-Americans, African-Americans, colored, all of these other names does not define a nationality, nor does it just define a legal status in terms of being a citizen of this country. That has always been the intention of the colonialists setting up this country. So now, when you're looking at things from that perspective in terms of a deliberate disenfranchisement or the denial of certain rights and privileges of people in this country, and that being the historical landscape, everything that you see makes sense. When you look at redlining or people being denied housing or other different type of opportunities, that was disenfranchisement, denying people the legal rights of citizenship and privileges that comes along with it. When you look at anti-miscegenation laws, that is also a denial of a legal status. You can't marry a certain person. You can't form family units with a certain person. You don't have that right as a citizen. When you look at the denial of employment opportunities or the denial of being able to go to certain educational institutions, all of it represents a consistent theme of disenfranchisement since this country started. Voter suppression, disenfranchisement. So now, when you look at in 1870, when you had that 15th Amendment that on a federal level said that you can't discriminate against people's race based on them being a voter, you know, all people can vote. that federal law was not being respected when it comes to states' rights. And that's a constant discussion that you even see today when it comes to federal oversight or federal preclearance as opposed to states' rights. States should be able to do and say whatever they want. They shouldn't have to report to or be beholden to the federal government. It's constantly being discussed. You know what I'm saying? So after Reconstruction, and you started to see these amendments being passed about not discriminated against people based upon their race when it comes to voting, or not discriminated against people, period. And you had a large influx of people of African descent who started to register to vote and be involved in the political process. So, for example, in like 1896 in Louisiana, you had over 130,000 people of African descent who were registered to vote and engaged in the political process within a span of 5 years, based upon voter suppression, intimidation, murder, other different tactics being used by people to discourage people of African descent participating in the political process. In a span of 5 years, you had people in Louisiana who were registered to vote in numbers of 130,000 that shrunk to 1,300 people in that short span of time. In that short span of time. So now, let me go back a little bit and talk about the Three-Fifths Compromise in 1787, where you had a U.S. Constitutional Congress, and the North and the South made a compromise on the legal status and identity of people of African descent. So what the Three-Fifths Compromise is because states in the South had more enslaved people, they wanted to count those enslaved people as a part of their census, which means if you have a greater population of people counted in your census, that means you need to have more representation in the House of Representatives. So they wanted to count people, enslaved people, as a part of their census so they can have more representation in the House of Representatives. But the South didn't want to pay taxes for that amount of people that they're counting in their census. So basically they told the North, like, yo, we need to count all of these people, but we don't want to pay taxes for these people that we count. The North was like, nah, you can't do that. If you're going to count these people, then you need to pay taxes that's equivalent to the people that you count. So they debated on it, and then they came to a compromise and said, and the North and the South agreed and said, yo, we just gonna count them as 3/5 of a person then. We gonna count them as 60% of a white person so that you can use them as representation when it comes to the House of Representatives. Again, it's this question of legal status when it comes to people of African descent or indigenous people, which has always been a consistent theme since the founding of this country, even to this day. There are many different instances or examples on a federal level, on a state level, on a local level of laws that align with this whole idea of people of African descent or indigenous people are not citizens. They do not deserve the rights and the privileges of citizens, and they do not deserve a legal status here. When you look at the laws that were passed all throughout the time of segregation, it was all about disenfranchising people that they did not see as citizens, that they did not respect as having a legal status. So some people who don't know any of this history make ignorant statements like, my ancestors, people ain't died to vote. Well, in 1946, there was a man named Maceo Snipes in Georgia who was a World War II veteran who was warned not to cast a ballot or not to vote in a local election. He did anyway. A few days later, he's at home sitting in the kitchen eating dinner with his mother, and he hears a knock at the door. He goes to the front door, and it's his white friend that is at the front door with two other white guys. He steps out on the porch, and they shoot him in the abdomen for voting. They shoot him on his porch for voting. His mother has to help him walk miles to get to a place, to get in a vehicle, to get taken to a local hospital. When he gets to the local hospital, he dies because he couldn't get a blood transfusion, because that hospital didn't have black blood. Even blood was segregated during that time. And he died because of that. He literally died for voting. That was in 1946. You could take it back to 1898 with the Wilmington Massacre that happened in North Carolina, where Wilmington's white supremacist community, and I say it that way because that was the campaign publicly that they promoted in terms of creating an insurrection and replacing the city government. They destroyed homes, businesses, murdered people because city government was biracial, and they didn't like that. They didn't like it. So a woman named Rebecca Felton, who was a so-called suffragist, gave a public speech, which was a dog whistle, telling these white supremacists that they need to protect white women from these savages, black men. If the scripture doesn't protect them, if this doesn't protect them, then y'all need to lynch them. She gave a public speech that said that. So to retort that speech, a 32-year-old man named Alexander Manley, who was the editor of a local newspaper, wrote a rebuttal in the newspaper and told her straight up that white women have consensual sex with black men. That inflamed these white supremacists. And it was based on that where eventually Manley, as the editor of the newspaper, shut down his operation. He was getting a lot of heat. Some of the local black community members was letting him know that he needs to take back what he actually said. And it was a lot of fear during that time. And these white supremacists established a core group of them and made a document outlining all of what their demands in terms of the members of the black community, and that they had to abide by those demands by 7:30 a.m. the next morning. They ended up burning down businesses, homes, murdering people, and replacing the whole entire city government with white supremacists. And then got reelected years after that. If you were to do research on the key members who were a part of this insurrection in Wilmington, you'll see their political careers these are people who eventually went on to become congresspeople, senators, having all of these other different positions of power, not just simply in North Carolina, but within this country. All of it based upon disenfranchising people of African descent and indigenous people. Again, that has been the consistent theme throughout the history of this country. That is just the facts. So when you look at the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that Civil Rights Act, which is a federal law, and I cannot stress enough that there has always been this consistent debate in this country in regards to the federal government and states' rights, where you may see a federal law that's being passed or a certain act or bill that's being passed, and people in the states ain't with that. They're not following it. They do whatever they want. And a lot of times the federal government may not even intervene with what's going on in certain states. So for example, if you have something that is going against the federal government in a certain state that is putting the people in that state in jeopardy, a lot of times the federal government wouldn't just step in, because that wouldn't be following the chain of command. They would have to be deputized by the governor. And if the governor's down with what's going on, the federal government ain't gonna step in. They're gonna let the states do what they want to do. Right? So when you look at the Constitution, you look at all of these different amendments and these bills and everything else, a lot of times that doesn't trickle down to a state level, because a lot of times states do whatever the hell they want to do. So even though the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, a short time after that, that's when you had the Bloody Sunday, the March on Selma in 1965. That March on Selma was for voting rights. Just a year before that, the Civil Rights Act was passed. That should have covered voting rights, because voting rights were given to so-called people of African descent, indigenous people, back in 1870 with the 15th Amendment. But you have all of this time period happening from 1870 onward, where you have voter suppression. You have people being murdered for voting or trying to vote. You had all white primaries where you couldn't even vote in a primary election if you weren't white. All of these different tactics used as a form of voter suppression. You also had literacy tests. If you couldn't read certain things, they could deny you outright the ability to vote. They had interpretation tests, where sometimes they'd take passages that are either legalese or passages from the Constitution and tell you to interpret it. And if you couldn't, you ain't voting. They had poll taxes. They had all of these various different tactics to discourage people from being involved in the political process and disenfranchising people. Back during that time, they'd just tell you straight up, nigger, you ain't voting. Or they would block polling sites with armed guards and dare you to set foot in there. That's the history of this country. But you have people today with the same exact mentality of disenfranchising people and creating these various different tactics to make sure that people are not involved in the political process. So now in 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was passed, a key aspect of that Voting Rights Act, which is Section 4B and Section 5, required federal oversight or pre-clearance when it came down to changing election laws or election boards or anything dealing with the political process in your jurisdiction. You had to have federal oversight, and that was put in place based upon jurisdictions or areas that had a history of discrimination. That's Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Section 4B gave a formula that was used as a criteria for defining what jurisdictions had to have the federal oversight or the federal pre-clearance before they change anything dealing with their election laws. So in 2013, Shelby County, Alabama, took the government to court and said, yo, that's unconstitutional. That Voting Rights Act is unconstitutional. This is in 2013, y'all. That Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. So 2013, Shelby County says that's unconstitutional. You shouldn't have no federal pre-clearance or federal oversight when it came to changing election laws. They took it to U.S. District Court, lost in 2011. Took it to appeals court, 2012, lost. Then they took it to the highest court in the land, Supreme Court, 2013. And the Supreme Court upheld their notion that the Voting Rights Act had unconstitutional elements in it. And their justification for saying that is that Section 4B that I mentioned, that gave a formula for how to define which jurisdictions or areas had to have federal oversight. Their logic was, well, that was based on data and demographics back in 1964. So that doesn't apply today. So it's unconstitutional to use a 1960-something year formula to define data or jurisdictions that are today. It's unconstitutional to do that. So that's what the Supreme Court said. So essentially, by them declaring that it was unconstitutional, that you couldn't have federal oversight or pre-clearance for certain jurisdictions that don't have data of a history of discrimination, you can't use that. You can't use that formula. That formula is over 40-something years old. So how could you say that this jurisdiction or this area has a history of discrimination when that formula is based on the 1960s? We're in the 2020s now. We're in a post-racial America. Our jurisdiction doesn't have any kind of racial discrimination or whatever because there's no data to define that. So you can't have the federal oversight because there's no formula to define whether or not there has been a history of discrimination in this area. And that's a landmark case because what ends up happening is it sets a standard now. And that standard is no local boards of election, no jurisdictions require federal oversight to change their election laws. That federal oversight or pre-clearance was put in place originally because people needed a neutral party to oversee what was going on in these different jurisdictions related to election law. So that federal oversight or that federal pre-clearance is a neutral position. It's not a Republican or a Democrat or a person in that position. It's a neutral position. So because of that 2013 Supreme Court case, it threw out that aspect of the Voting Rights Act, which means you have places now that's making up their own election laws. And these laws are not being made up from people that are in neutral positions. They are the legislators. They are people who have a political agenda. One of the biggest examples of that is in Georgia. The same place that Maceo Snipes was shot on his front porch in 1946. There's a history of voter suppression there and disenfranchisement. So the governor of Georgia, he signs a new election law. One of the things that he does is he limits the hours for polling sites, which means if you're working, that site might be closed by the time you get off of work. So you ain't voting. Another thing that he signed into law is no more voting on Sundays. Why would he do something like that? Oh yeah, we're going to get into Texas too, Darren. Why would he sign a law like that? That there's not going to be no more voting on Sundays. Oh, because something that is traditional in Georgia amongst people of African descent is the Soul to the Polls Day, where people go to church on Sunday and in mass, they also go and vote on Sunday. But ain't no more voting on Sunday, according to the governor of Georgia. So ain't no more souls on a polls day. That was deliberately done to target people of African descent and to disenfranchise them. What about the misdemeanor of making it a criminal offense by giving somebody water, or food while they're waiting in line to vote. That's deliberately done to target not only people of African descent, but people who are traditionally the prime voters in your jurisdiction, who are our elders. They vote in every election because these members of our family understand the importance of having a legal status and citizenship. Many of them may have served in the military. They own property. So they know the importance of being involved in the political process. But now it's a misdemeanor, or it's a criminal offense if you have someone that's an elder in line waiting to vote. And we've seen how those lines look in Atlanta and in Georgia and in other places. It's a criminal offense if you give your grandmother or grandfather or somebody else in your family water or food to drink while they're waiting to vote. That's specifically done to target and disenfranchise people of African descent. Also, I'm a machine inspector with the local board of elections here in my city where I live. And one of the procedures that we have here in New York State is if a person comes to our polling site and they're not registered at that particular polling site, they have to go to another site. We give them directions and let them know where their actual polling site is so they can go there, or they may be able to vote affidavit. And we accept the ballot and we turn that ballot in with all of the other ballots separately, of course, because it's an affidavit ballot. But we do that at the end of the evening when the polling site closes. In Georgia, they just passed a law saying that if you show up at a polling site and it's not your polling site, you can vote affidavit, but you can only bring that affidavit ballot to your original polling site after 5 p.m. Like, why? Why are you doing all that? Again, it's done to deliberately disenfranchise people who vote affidavit. Because in the last election, about 44% of the votes that were of affidavits were people who were at the wrong polling site. 44% of those ballots. And the majority of those ballots, about over 60% of them, were for Joe Biden. So the governor of Georgia has created some of these tactics, closing certain polling sites in areas where you have a critical mass or a higher concentration of people of African descent. And then on top of that, not providing the proper means of communicating to the people that there's no longer a polling site here. You may just show up and the polling site that you've been going to for a while is just not there anymore. You have all of these tactics which are reflective of the exact same tactics that were used historically in this country to disenfranchise people of African descent and indigenous people. Back in the day, it was more in your face. Now, it's more sophisticated, but the same intention is there to keep people from having a legal status and to participate equitably in this society as citizens with rights and privileges. So now look at Texas. Also in Georgia, that you got to have ID. And if you vote affidavit, you're going to have to put your ID number on that affidavit, ballot, or envelope. You're going to have to put your 4 digits of your social security number on there and make it cumbersome like that, because what ends up happening is when that ballot gets to the Board of Elections, if your last 4 digits of your social security number is wrong, or your number on your ID or license is wrong, they can toss that ballot. So they're creating all of these ways in order to not just disenfranchise people, but to toss ballots, to get people restricted from being able to participate in the political process. Texas doing the same exact thing. closing polling sites, limiting the amount of time that people can go to vote. We're starting to see this all over the country, and all of it goes back to that 2013 Supreme Court decision that Shelby County in Alabama were able to get the Supreme Court to say that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 had unconstitutional elements in it. So now you're seeing these local boards of elections doing whatever they want and making it very difficult for everyday people to be involved in the political process. Another thing that has to change is going back to what I said about 1787 3/5 compromise, where people of African descent were said to be 60% of a white person or 3/5 of a human being in order to be counted in the census of the southern states. Today, presently, when you have people who are incarcerated in places that are outside of their voting jurisdiction or in a different county or maybe even a different state, these people who are incarcerated are counted in the census in that area where they're incarcerated. They can't vote, but they're counted in the census. So when you see these little towns with a population of 10,000 people or less, or even a little more, and their main industry is a big correctional facility, a medium or maximum correctional facility in the middle of their little township, the people in there are being counted in the census of being residents of that little small municipality, which means that small little municipality gets more legislative representation and government resources based upon the census data that is using the bodies of people who are incarcerated there for those resources and for that legislative representation. That has to change because it's reflective of the same type of 3/5 compromise that happened in 1787. But yet you got people walking around saying, oh, my vote don't matter. I'm not involved in the political process. My people didn't die to vote. You don't know history. If you make statements like that, you do not know history. That has been a consistent theme from the founding of this country to this very day. So that's vitally important. One of the things that I encourage all of you to do is to check out what's going on right now with the H.R. 4 bill, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Because that H.R. 4 bill that passed the House and now maybe getting voted on by the Senate in the next week or so is designed to reinforce and to restore those voting rights acts in terms of those sections that provides federal oversight and pre-clearance when it comes to changing election laws on a state level and a local level. So that's being debated right now in Congress. So it's important that you know what's actually going on in regards to that, because it's literally going to change the landscape nationally again and on a local level. So that's the H.R. 4 bill, or what they call the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. You need to be aware of what's going on in Congress right now and how that's going to affect you on a local level. Additionally, if you want to understand any of what I'm talking about in terms of voter suppression and the history of that, it has to be approached from the perspective of the disenfranchisement of people of African descent, indigenous people in terms of a legal status in this country and citizens' rights. Everything that you see from a federal to a state, a regional, a local level, laws that you've seen being passed from the inception of this country in 1776 all the way to this day, you have to look at it through the lens of disenfranchisement. Does it disenfranchise people or does it not? And a lot of it is specifically being targeted towards people of African descent or indigenous people, because we were never planned. It was never planned, or we were never considered to be citizens of this land or having a legal status. So it's always been a fight and a debate on where should we put these people, or how should these people be treated in terms of having some citizenship or legal status. If you look at any of the different laws and stuff that have been passed, it all revolves around legal status and citizenship. So in addition to being aware of what's going on with HR 4 and researching just the history in this country in terms of voter suppression, it's also important for you to be involved in the local elections where you live at. You know, being aware of who your public officials are, what their responsibilities are in terms of public servants, what they should be doing and what is not a part of what their job is. You need to know what's actually going on, because the local laws literally change the landscape where you live. So that's the second thing, being involved in the political process. And the third thing, vote. Vote. Yeah, some people literally died to vote. And for you to have that ability to be involved in the political process. Why is that important? Well, the same reason it is important for you, true indeed, Darren, and school board elections. The same reason why it is important for you to be counted in the census. Because being counted in the census gives the government a sense of the resources that need to be allocated to that particular area. And if you're not counted in the census, then it undermines the ability for the government to support certain type of projects, programs, and initiatives and institutions in the place where you live. So you got to be counted in the census. You know? True indeed. Yup. School board elections, community leadership. You have to be involved. You got to know what's going on. You got to know what's going on. True indeed, Greg. I just spoke about that. In New Orleans, like I mentioned, in Louisiana, in 1896, after Reconstruction, and you know, when people of African descent started to get involved in registering to vote and being a part of the political process, you had over 130,000 people in Louisiana alone of African descent that were registered voters. But in a short time period of this, about 5 years, it shrunk from 130,000 to 1,300 people. You know, true indeed, Divine. A ban on drive-through voting, new regulations for early voting. Yeah, all of that is designed specifically to disenfranchise people. It does not make it easier for people to actually express their citizens' rights and privileges, to vote in an election and also to run for public office. So when you look at citizen rights like that, the right to worship, the right to a fair trial, the right to be involved in the political process, to vote, to run for political office, all of those rights and privileges that naturally come along with citizenship have always been assailed when it came to us, and it comes to us as people of African descent and indigenous people. That's the history of this country. The way that we can change that is not only being involved and reaffirming or asserting our citizenship. And that's what I like about that whole idea of foundational Black Americans, because it also speaks to not only citizenship in terms of rights and privileges, but also citizenship when it comes to an international status, because it's speaking to a nationality in a sense where you represent your citizenship as a member of this country. Traditionally in this country, people did not want us to have citizenship or any kind of legal status. And for many of us to have a mindset like, I don't care about citizenship, I don't care about having no legal status, that just works in favor of people who are in control and dominate not only the economy, but the resources as well as the institutions and the political landscape. Because you don't have a voice and you're not included, but yet at the same time, you are subjected to the decisions that they are going to make, which is usually not in any of our favor. Because unless you reflect the wealthy or the elite or the 10%, then that landscape that's based upon laws is going to be slanted in favor of those who are actually creating the laws. Process. Okay. I don't know what happened. It just cut off for a second. I think I had an issue with my connection. But one of the last things that I'm going to leave you with is, as a 5%, one of the things that we oftentimes say is power is the truth, right? And power is also influence. And one of the most influential things that you can do is to be involved in the political process where you live by first having knowledge of what's actually going on and being wise enough to know how to position yourself and move in relationship to those power dynamics in that political landscape where you live. You learn that by being involved in the process, by gaining more knowledge of who your representatives are, what are their roles and responsibilities, how they vote on certain issues, and how that's literally affecting the landscape where you live. So the power being the truth is also being in that position of influence and being influential when it comes to what is happening in the political landscape where you live. And it starts with knowledge. You got to know what's actually going on locally. And then from there, you gain wisdom. You gain a greater insight on how to navigate locally where you live and where you need to position yourself, who you need to align yourself with and who you need to stay away from. Where are the dynamics of power and how does that shape the landscape where you live? You learn the wise ways in terms of navigating those type of spaces. And then ultimately you understand or see things for what they are, not what they appear to be. But it all starts with knowledge. You got to be aware and conscious of what's going on where you live at. So our wilderness was inspiring, it was empowering, and it was educational, and just gave y'all some insight into what was on my mind in terms of the political process and some of the current events that's going on with HR 4 or the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, and just the importance of us being able to study the landscape in terms of historically our place in this country as people who are indigenous and people of African descent. Peace.